The sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the windows of the couple's cozy home. The house was bustling with life as friends and family gathered for a special dinner party. The evening was meant to be filled with laughter, conversation, and delicious food. The wife, Emily, had spent the entire afternoon preparing for the event. She had planned everything carefully, from the menu to the decorations, wanting everything to be perfect. Emily stood at the dining table, carefully arranging the plates and utensils, ensuring each setting was just right. She had always taken pride in hosting these gatherings, even if they sometimes made her feel a bit anxious. There was a certain pressure to impress, especially with her husband, Mark, being a perfectionist. He was often quick to notice even the smallest mistakes, and this time, Emily had hoped to avoid any unnecessary tension. But as she set the last fork in place, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Mark, who had been helping prepare the food in the kitchen, walked into the dining room with a distracted look on his face. He glanced over at the table, and his eyes immediately narrowed. Emily could feel the shift in the air as he walked closer to inspect the settings. The smile she had on her face started to fade as she watched him scrutinize every detail. "Why is the fork on the wrong side?" Mark's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet of the room. Emily's heart sank. She had checked the placement twice to make sure everything was in order. But now Mark was pointing out a small mistake, a fork on the left instead of the right. "I'll fix it," she said softly, trying to keep her tone calm. She wasn't upset by the small mistake, but she could feel the tension building already. Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked around the table, inspecting every other setting. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the fork and straightened a few glasses. She wanted the evening to go smoothly, but with Mark's perfectionist nature, it was hard to escape the feeling of walking on eggshells. As she finished fixing the last of the details, she glanced at Mark, hoping he would at least acknowledge her effort. But instead, he crossed his arms and shook his head. "This is just sloppy, Emily," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Emily took a deep breath, trying not to let her emotions get the best of her. "I've been working on this all day," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Everything is ready. The guests will be here soon, and we need to relax." But Mark's eyes remained cold, his frustration growing. He stepped back from the table, still shaking his head. "This isn't how it should look. You can't even get something as simple as a table setting right." His words stung, but Emily tried to ignore them. She had dealt with this before, the criticism, the pressure to be perfect in his eyes. She quickly moved past him, grabbing the last few items to set on the table. The guests were arriving, and she didn't want anyone to see the tension between her and Mark. Emily just hoped that once everyone arrived, the mood would shift, and the evening would go as planned. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't quite right, and the stress of trying to keep everything together was starting to take its toll. As Emily finished putting the last touches on the table, the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the first guests. She straightened up quickly, trying to put on a smile as she heard Mark mumble something under his breath. He had already moved to the kitchen, his eyes still dark with irritation. The sound of his footsteps echoed as he walked back and forth, not bothering to hide his displeasure. Emily opened the door to greet the guests, putting on her best friendly smile. "Welcome," she said warmly, trying to mask the tension that had started to build. Her heart was still racing from the earlier exchange with Mark. She ushered them in, trying to seem composed, but it wasn't easy. The guests were all eager and excited to see each other, but Emily couldn't help but feel a knot form in her stomach. She could already sense that the evening wasn't going to be as relaxing as she had hoped. As the guests settled into the living room, Emily caught a glimpse of Mark in the kitchen. His movements were fast and sharp, almost like he was rushing to finish something. She knew he was trying to keep everything in order, but there was something unsettling about his energy tonight. He wasn't his usual self. Instead of talking to the guests and making them feel comfortable, he was more focused on the smallest details. He didn't even look up as Emily walked by, his eyes fixed on the stove. Trying to shake off the unease, Emily joined the guests in the living room. She offered drinks and appetizers, keeping the conversation light. It was nice to hear the laughter of her friends and family, even though it felt a bit distant to her. She kept glancing toward the kitchen, where Mark still seemed consumed by the preparations. He was taking so much time on things that didn't matter, while the guests were waiting for the dinner to begin. It didn't take long for the tension in the air to grow thicker. Emily could feel the weight of the silence whenever Mark entered the room. He would walk by without saying a word, his eyes avoiding hers. The guests began to notice the awkwardness between the couple, but no one dared to speak up. They were all used to seeing Mark as the confident, composed husband, and Emily as the caring, gentle wife. But tonight, things felt off. One of the guests tried to break the silence by striking up a conversation with Emily, but she could barely focus on what they were saying. All she could think about was Mark and how his behavior was starting to affect everything. She had always known that he could be demanding at times, but this was different. Tonight, his frustration seemed sharper, almost as though it was directed at her. Emily tried to distract herself by engaging in the conversation, but her mind kept drifting back to the tension in the kitchen. After a few minutes, she decided to check on Mark. She needed to make sure he wasn't too overwhelmed by everything. As she walked into the kitchen, she found him standing over the stove, stirring a pot with quick, agitated movements. His face was tense, his jaw clenched tightly. Emily took a deep breath before speaking, not wanting to upset him further, but she couldn't ignore the discomfort any longer. "Mark, are you okay?" she asked softly, stepping closer to him. He didn't respond at first. Instead, he let out a heavy sigh, clearly irritated. "I'm fine," he muttered, not looking at her. Emily's heart sank. It was clear that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what had changed. All she wanted was for the evening to go smoothly, but she was beginning to wonder if that was even possible anymore. The stress of trying to please everyone, including Mark, was starting to weigh on her. The evening continued, but the mood had become increasingly strained. Emily did her best to keep up the pretense that everything was fine. She moved between the guests, smiling and engaging in conversations, but each time she glanced toward the kitchen, her stomach would tighten. Mark hadn't emerged from the kitchen in a while, and the longer he stayed in there, the more nervous she became. His silence felt like a weight that hung in the air, making it hard for her to focus on anything else. The guests, sensing the tension but unsure of its source, began to grow more quiet. Their casual chatter faltered whenever Mark walked into the room. His stiff posture and unwillingness to engage made everyone feel like they were walking on eggshells. Emily was used to his perfectionist ways, but tonight, his frustration seemed to have reached a boiling point. She couldn't help but wonder why everything felt so much worse than usual. What had changed? Why was he so upset, even with everyone else there? After a few more minutes of trying to keep the conversation going, Emily felt the air grow heavy. She could feel the guests' unease, as though they were all waiting for something to happen. She had hoped the evening would be an escape from the usual pressures, but instead, it seemed to be amplifying everything. The clinking of glasses, the laughter from the other room, none of it seemed to make her feel better. Her eyes kept drifting to Mark, who was now standing by the stove, staring down at the pot he was cooking, his face unreadable. Finally, unable to ignore the growing discomfort any longer, Emily decided to approach him again. She walked slowly into the kitchen, feeling a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to make things worse, but the silence between them had become unbearable. "Mark," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm, "is everything all right? You've been in here for so long." He didn't look up at first. His hand tightened around the wooden spoon he was holding, and for a moment, Emily wasn't sure he would respond. When he finally did, his voice was low and strained. "Everything's fine. Just trying to make sure everything is perfect." Emily took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't just about the table setting anymore. It never was. This was about something deeper, about the way Mark expected perfection in everything, and how that pressure always seemed to fall on her. She wanted to say something, to let him know how exhausting it was to always be under the microscope, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she forced a smile, trying to make light of the situation. "I think everyone's just happy to be here," she said gently. "We don't need everything to be perfect, Mark. They're here to enjoy the evening." Mark's eyes flicked toward her, but they were cold, distant. "They don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. His frustration was mounting, his voice rising with each word. "You don't understand. You never do." Emily's heart sank. It was like he wasn't hearing her at all. The years of carrying the weight of his expectations, the pressure to be the perfect wife, the perfect host, it was all coming to a head. And now, there was no escaping it. Before she could say anything else, Mark's voice cut through the room. "This isn't working, Emily. You never get it right." She felt her pulse quicken. The tension was thick, suffocating. Emily knew the situation was about to get worse, but she wasn't sure how to stop it. She had hoped the night would pass without conflict, that they could at least pretend for a few hours. But it was clear now that wasn't going to happen. The quiet moment in the kitchen had quickly turned into a silent standoff, and Emily knew things were about to take a much darker turn. The tension between Emily and Mark was now undeniable, and it seemed to fill every corner of the room. The noise from the guests outside, once lively and full of chatter, felt distant now. Emily could no longer focus on the conversations. Her mind kept replaying Mark's harsh words. "You never get it right." The words stung more than she expected. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but hearing it tonight, with everything else piling up, made it hit harder. She took a slow, steadying breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. She knew she couldn't let this spiral out of control, but at the same time, she felt a deep sadness settle in her chest. She had always tried to keep their home warm and welcoming, to make sure everything was perfect. She wanted him to be proud of her, but now, as she stood in the kitchen, it felt like none of that mattered. The more she tried, the more distant Mark became. Mark, however, seemed oblivious to her inner turmoil. He was still staring down at the pot on the stove, his face still tense, his hands working quickly, almost violently stirring the food. He was lost in his own frustration. Emily stood there for a moment, unsure of how to break the silence. The words she wanted to say, how unfair this all felt, how exhausted she was, stuck in her throat. She was too afraid of making things worse, too afraid of saying something that would push him even further away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of quiet, Emily spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mark, I know you want everything to be perfect, but I need you to see that I'm doing my best. I don't need to be perfect, and neither do you." Her words hung in the air, but Mark didn't respond right away. He didn't even look up. The air between them grew even heavier, and Emily began to doubt herself. Had she said the wrong thing? Was she just making everything worse? But then Mark finally turned to face her. His expression had softened, but there was still something cold in his eyes. He exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of the evening had finally hit him. "I don't know what's wrong with me tonight," he muttered. I get so frustrated with everything. Nothing ever seems to go right. You don't see it, but I have to make sure everything works perfectly. For everyone." Emily took a step toward him, her heart aching. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but she also wanted him to understand how she felt. "I see how hard you try, Mark, but I can't keep trying to fix things for both of us. I can't carry it all on my own." The words were out before she could stop them, and they felt like a release, like the truth she had been holding back for so long. She had been carrying the weight of Mark's expectations, the weight of being the perfect wife, the perfect host, and it had started to break her. Mark didn't say anything at first. His eyes softened as he seemed to process her words. There was a long pause, a space where neither of them knew what to do next. Emily wasn't sure if he understood, or if he would even try to change. But in that moment, at least, she felt like she had said what needed to be said. The silence in the kitchen was deafening, but Emily couldn't bring herself to walk away. She stood there, waiting, hoping that Mark might finally see her, truly see her. She wasn't just his wife. She wasn't just the person who set the table and planned the dinners. She was a person, too, with her own needs and limits. And tonight, she needed him to understand. But before either of them could speak again, the sound of laughter from the living room pierced the stillness. The guests were enjoying themselves, oblivious to the emotional storm that had just passed between the couple. Emily felt a mix of frustration and relief. The night was still moving forward, but she wasn't sure where she and Mark stood anymore. Would things change after this? Or would they just keep going on like nothing had happened? The silence in the kitchen stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant laughter and chatter from the living room. Emily stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. The words she had said to Mark felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders, but at the same time, it was as if she had just opened a door to a place she wasn't sure she was ready to walk into. She wasn't sure where to go from here. Would Mark finally understand her? Would things change? Or was this just another cycle in their strained relationship? Mark seemed lost in thought, his hand still gripping the wooden spoon, though he no longer stirred the pot. He stood there, almost frozen, his eyes distant. For a brief moment, Emily wondered if he even heard her words or if they had gone unnoticed, just like so many things in their life together. The frustration she felt earlier, that nagging sense of being unheard and unappreciated, began to rise again. She was tired of holding everything together, tired of always being the one to keep the peace. Taking a deep breath, Emily decided to break the silence. "Mark," she said softly, her voice quieter than before, "I didn't mean to make things harder. I just needed you to know how I've been feeling." For a few moments, there was no response. Emily could feel the weight of his indecision hanging in the air. She could see him working through his thoughts, but she wasn't sure what was going on inside his mind. Would he apologize? Would he acknowledge her feelings? Or would he retreat into himself, as he often did when confronted with any kind of criticism? Finally, Mark let out a sigh, his shoulders sagging. He set the spoon down on the counter, his hands running through his hair in frustration. He turned to face Emily, but his gaze was no longer cold or distant. There was a softness in his eyes, a vulnerability that she hadn't seen in a long time. "I don't know what's wrong with me," Mark said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I've been hard on you. I don't know how to stop. It's like I'm trying to make everything perfect because I can't handle it when things go wrong. But I don't want to keep pushing you away." Emily's heart softened at his words, but there was still a part of her that couldn't fully believe him. He had said things like this before, promises to change, to be better, but the pattern always repeated itself. Still, something about his tone felt different this time. There was a sincerity in his voice that made her hesitate, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. "I don't need you to make everything perfect, Mark," Emily replied gently, her voice full of emotion. "I need you to be here with me, to listen, to care about how I'm feeling, too. I need to know that we're in this together." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily felt like she was waiting for Mark to understand, to really see her in the way she had longed for. It wasn't just about the table settings or the dinner. It was about their whole relationship. The years of unspoken tension, the frustration, the exhaustion that had built up between them. It wasn't just about him being hard on her. It was about them both learning to communicate, to share the emotional load. Mark took a deep breath, his face contorting slightly as though he was trying to process everything. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. Emily waited, unsure of what he would say. She could feel her heart racing, but she held her ground, unwilling to back down now. "I'm sorry, Emily," Mark said finally, his voice small but full of regret. "I never meant to hurt you. I know I've been unfair. I don't always know how to show you what I'm feeling. But I don't want to keep making the same mistakes." Emily's eyes softened as she looked at him, the raw sincerity in his voice cutting through the years of frustration. She could see that he was trying in his own way to understand her, to change. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't a quick fix, but it was a start. She stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out hesitantly. Mark met her gaze, and for the first time in a long while, they stood there, looking at each other with the possibility of something more than just tension between them. It wasn't the end of their struggles, but it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't sure where things would go from here, but she knew that for the first time in a long time, they were truly communicating, truly facing the truth of their relationship. It wasn't perfect, but maybe it didn't have to be. The air between Emily and Mark was still heavy, but for the first time that evening, there was a flicker of something more hopeful. Emily could feel the tension start to dissolve, just a little, as Mark's apology hung in the air. He wasn't perfect, and she knew that, but hearing him admit that he had been unfair to her made her heart swell with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. It wasn't much, but it was a start she hadn't expected to get tonight. Mark looked at her, his eyes softer now, like he was finally seeing her. "I've been so focused on everything being perfect," he said quietly, as though confessing a truth he hadn't been able to say before. "But I haven't been focusing on you, on us. I'm sorry, Emily. I really am." Emily felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. She knew that Mark's idea of perfection had always been his way of coping with his own insecurities, but hearing him acknowledge it felt like a small victory. It was something she hadn't dared to hope for, especially tonight when the evening seemed doomed to fail. She took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions wash over her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he could change, but it wasn't easy. For so long, she had been stuck in the cycle of trying to please him, of trying to meet his impossible standards. And though tonight had been rough, she realized it was also a turning point. Perhaps it was time for both of them to learn a new way of being together, one where they communicated openly and understood each other's needs. "I just want you to know, Mark," she said softly, "I don't need perfection. I need you to be with me, to show me that you care, even when things aren't perfect." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight. It was a request, but also a declaration that she was no longer willing to just settle for the quiet suffering that had existed between them. She needed more than just a husband who expected everything to be flawless. She needed someone who could listen, who could meet her halfway. Mark seemed to understand. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers, as though he were trying to gauge how much trust he had left to earn. "I know I've been a lot to handle. I've let my expectations get in the way of seeing what's really important, and I don't want to keep doing that." Emily nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. It was the honesty she had longed to hear, the kind of honesty that made her feel like she wasn't alone in this. She had spent so many nights wondering if her feelings mattered, if she would ever be seen beyond the role of the wife who did everything just right. But tonight, she saw a glimpse of something different in Mark's eyes. He wasn't perfect, and she wasn't asking for him to be, but at least he was finally seeing her as a person, as someone who deserved more than just his frustration. The guests were still in the other room, but the noise now seemed far away, as though the world outside the kitchen didn't matter as much as it used to. For the first time in what felt like years, Emily felt a small sense of peace. It wasn't the perfect evening she had hoped for, but it was a real one, and that felt like enough. Mark reached out and gently touched her arm, a silent gesture of understanding. Emily looked up at him, and for a moment, their eyes met with a quiet connection. She didn't need grand gestures or promises that everything would change overnight. She just needed him to see her, to understand her, and to know that she wasn't going to accept being ignored anymore. For the first time in a long time, Emily allowed herself to feel hopeful. They had a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something better together. One small step at a time. "I'm glad we talked," Emily said, her voice a little softer now. "It's a start, Mark. I just need you to be there. For both of us." Mark nodded, a sincere smile tugging at his lips. "I will be, Emily. I promise." Though there were still many challenges ahead, in that moment, it felt like they had taken the first step toward a better understanding, a deeper connection. And for Emily, that was enough to hold on to. For now. The rest of the evening unfolded in a strange but comforting silence, the kind that came after an emotional release. Emily and Mark didn't rush back into the social scene with their guests right away. Instead, they stood in the kitchen for a few moments longer, processing the weight of what had just been said. Emily could feel a slight shift in the atmosphere between them, like a door had opened just a crack, letting in the possibility of something better. Mark was the first to break the silence. "I know I have a lot to work on," he said quietly, his voice filled with a kind of humility that Emily had rarely heard from him before. "But I don't want to keep pushing you away. I'm tired of pretending everything's okay when it's not." Emily nodded, appreciating the honesty. "It's not about pretending, Mark. It's about really being here, together. I need to feel like I'm not just going through the motions. We both deserve more than that." There was a brief pause, and then Mark reached out to touch her hand. It wasn't a grand gesture, but there was something sincere in it, a wordless promise that things could change, even if they were both unsure of how to take the next step. Emily didn't pull away. She let herself feel the connection between them, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, they could move forward. The laughter from the living room was still there, but it no longer felt like a distant noise. It felt like part of the evening again, part of the life they were trying to rebuild. Mark and Emily both took a deep breath before they finally turned to face the reality of the evening. The guests, the dinner, and the world outside the kitchen that had seemed so intimidating just moments before. "Let's join them," Emily said, her voice softer than before. "It's been a long night, but I think it'll be okay now." Mark nodded. "Yeah, I think so too." They walked into the living room together, side by side. The guests were still mingling, enjoying the drinks and appetizers Emily had carefully prepared. No one seemed to notice the shift that had happened between the couple. No one could have known about the silent battle that had just been fought, and the quiet resolution that had begun to take shape. To the outside world, everything appeared normal, and Emily felt a small sense of peace in that. She glanced at Mark, who was standing a little taller now, his shoulders less tense than before. He seemed calmer, more grounded. It was as if he had released some of the pressure he had been carrying. And though Emily knew there was still work to be done, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a beginning. The evening continued with conversations, laughter, and a sense of normalcy that Emily had feared would never return. But as the night wore on, she found herself laughing more freely, enjoying the warmth of her friends and family. And every now and then, her gaze would meet Mark's across the room, and there was something different in his eyes, a quiet understanding, a shared moment that spoke louder than words. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, they were truly seeing each other. As the last guests left, the house felt quieter, but there was an undeniable sense of relief in the air. Emily and Mark sat down together on the couch, tired but not in the same way they had been earlier. They weren't burdened by the weight of unspoken frustrations anymore. Instead, they were just two people, trying to figure out how to be together, how to be better. "I know we still have a lot to work on," Emily said, breaking the quiet. Mark nodded. "I do too, but I think we're finally on the right path." For the first time that night, Emily felt hopeful, not because everything was perfect, but because they were finally facing the truth together. And that, in itself, was a step toward something better. The evening ended not with grand resolutions or promises, but with a quiet understanding, a sense that things had changed. Maybe not overnight, but slowly, surely, they were finding their way back to each other. The days after the dinner party felt different, quieter in a way that made Emily feel both calm and uncertain. Mark had been trying harder. He listened more, paid attention to the small details, and most importantly, he was present in ways he hadn't been for a long time. Emily could see the effort in his eyes, even in the little things, like how he helped around the house without her asking, or how he initiated conversations instead of waiting for her to start them. But it wasn't just the gestures that stood out. It was the shift in their dynamic, a shift that felt like it was slowly rebuilding the foundation of their relationship. Emily had always known that Mark wasn't a bad person. He had never been cruel or malicious, but his need for control and perfection had created a distance between them. It had taken her a long time to understand that his behavior wasn't about her. It was about his own struggles, his own fears of failure. In many ways, he had been carrying a weight, and Emily had been carrying one too. She had been silently shouldering the pressure to keep everything in their lives perfect, to keep the peace, and to hold the pieces of their life together. It was exhausting, and that exhaustion had begun to show in ways she couldn't ignore anymore. But as the days passed, Emily started to feel something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. The weight wasn't as heavy anymore, and though there were still moments of tension, they didn't feel insurmountable. They were learning to talk, to share their feelings openly, and to be honest with each other about what they both needed. It wasn't easy. There were still times when old habits crept back in, and both of them had moments of doubt, but there was a shared understanding now that had been missing before. They were finally taking the time to really hear each other. One evening, as the sun began to set, Emily and Mark sat down together in the living room after dinner. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the evening settling around them. They didn't need to fill the space with words or forced conversation. Just being in each other's presence felt enough. Mark broke the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night, about not needing perfection." He paused, looking over at her with a seriousness that matched the weight of his words. "It's not easy for me to let go of that, but I'm trying. I want to get better, for both of us." Emily smiled softly. "I don't need you to change overnight, Mark. I just need you to keep trying, to keep showing up, even when things aren't perfect." His gaze softened as he nodded. "I can do that. I want to do that." And in that moment, Emily realized how much she had changed too. She had spent so long trying to please everyone, trying to make things perfect, that she had forgotten what it felt like to just be herself. But now she was learning to speak her truth, to set boundaries, and to ask for what she needed. It wasn't always easy, but she was beginning to trust herself again. As the weeks went by, Emily and Mark continued to work through their challenges. They learned to communicate better, to respect each other's space and needs. There were still bumps along the way, times when old patterns threatened to resurface, but they were no longer afraid to address the issues as they came. They had found a way to be open with each other, to not let small frustrations build up until they exploded. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Emily glanced over at Mark. He was different. She could see it. Softer, more present. She had spent so long wondering if they could make it, if they could find their way back to each other. And now, looking at him, she knew they were doing just that. Slowly, steadily, they were rebuilding not just their relationship but themselves. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But maybe that was okay. What mattered now was that they were working together, side by side, facing the challenges of life with a new understanding. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Emily felt confident in their ability to navigate it together. And that, in the end, was enough.